Hello everybody and welcome to the third day of the France and Australia Bushfire Science Workshop. Opportunities for collaboration brought to you by the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre, the Group of 8 in Australia, the Ambassador and the French Embassy in Australia and the SAFE Cluster. My name is Dr. John Bates. I'm the Research Director at the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC in Australia, and I'll be the workshop facilitator for today. I would like to say good morning to our colleagues from Europe, good afternoon and good evening to our colleagues joining us from Australia and from New Caledonia as well today. The webinar is being recorded for later online access, and as attendees you will receive an email when the video is available on the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC website. All presentation slides will also be made available to you from that website. During the webinar today, you can ask a question at any time during the workshop using the Q&A function. You'll find that in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And I do encourage you to ask questions. It is not often we get together colleagues from so many parts of the world to talk about bushfire science, and you should make the most of that opportunity. This is the third day, as I said, of this series of workshops, and the focus today is on environmental restoration, future risks, and ways in which we in Australia and our colleagues in France and New Caledonia can work together and to share the information that we have, things that we're learning, look at the problems and things that are the same, and certainly look at knowledge sharing. So I think if you could keep your mind open and look towards that, that would be very, very important. Before we do start, for those particularly in Australia, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting today, to pay my, to acknowledge their ancestors past, present and emerging, and the contribution that they've made to looking after our land for so many decades and centuries before us. Our first panel today is looking at environmental restoration, and the chair for that panel is Professor Kathy Belov from the University of Sydney. And I think, Kathy, I will pass over to you because I believe that you can probably do a far better introduction to yourself and your interests in wildlife genomics. And I'll pass over to you for the first panel for today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And it's lovely to be here talking to you all and facilitating a panel which will look at collaboration between Australian and French universities. I too would like to acknowledge the lands on which I am sitting. I am sitting on Wallamedigal land, which is in Sydney, and I acknowledge our elders, past and present and emerging, and particularly any Indigenous people that might be participating in the workshop. So as John mentioned, I'm a geneticist. I'm based at the University of Sydney. So I'm very fortunate that in my jobs, I get to both work in conservation and also look after international partnerships. I'm also the Vice Chancellor Global Engagement at the University of Sydney. And it's been a busy year between bushfires and pandemics. But I've very much been involved in planning for the recovery of koala populations following the bushfires. So as many of you may know, koalas face lots of threats, including urbanization, habitat fragmentation, disease, and now, of course, these recent bushfires. So last time I looked, and you fire experts will know more than I do, about 18 million hectares burnt along the east coast of Australia. Over 1 billion animals died, and 25% of koala habitat was affected. And recent estimates suggest that we've lost about 70% of many koala populations. So I've been working very closely with the New South Wales Environment Minister and team to think about how we manage koala populations looking forward. So from my own personal point of view, I'm looking forward to learning more about, recovery post-fire, future-proofing populations post-fire, managing fragmentation of landscape due to fire, and also thinking a lot about how we manage our landscape given the effects of climate change. So I'm here to learn. We've got 4 fantastic speakers talking about environmental restoration broadly, but really I think we're focusing more on how to manage fire, how landscapes are recovering, and to come back to my initial welcome, I hope that there will be a chance to talk a little bit about cultural burning and Indigenous practices in fire management. So each of our speakers will have 10 minutes to present. I will give you a 2-minute warning to let you know when your time is almost up. And first off, we have Dr. Adam Ali from the University of Montpellier. Adam is a paleo ecologist, which is fascinating. So his research is based on the analysis of various proxies, such as wood coals, plant micro-remains, and pollen, which are trapped in lake and peat sediments. And he's able to use this information to characterize natural variability due to fire disturbance. So over to you, Adam. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for this this invitation, and I will not talk to paleo today because I think that it's more important to focus on restoration purposes. So I will be very short because it's not my aim research about restoration, but I just want to say some sentence in order to trigger the discussions and these purposes. So I'm a professor at the University of Montpellier, and that we say, Katie, I'm a specialist of paleoecology, and I use charcoal and also pollen remain sequestered in lake sediment in order to have information on the past fire activity and this impact on vegetation dynamics. But also we use other proxies in order to have information about climate changes and to see the interaction between fire and these vegetations in a long-term perspective. So sometimes we can get important information about the main vegetations that will be in a given place according to the climate condition, but also the response about this vegetation according to fire activity. But today, I just want to talk about the situation and the present day situations in Europe, but also I think that this situation is also the same around the world. And the main thing is these present day situations, next, please. I think that the current situations force government to rethink how to manage wildfire to reduce the risk, because during this couple of years, both natural and social conditions act together to create the current problem of fire and forest fire. Because it's quite sure that land use, also including intense fire suppressions and road construction, have created an unprecedented fuel load that contributes to the development of increasingly severe forest fire that we name mega fires. So I think that now it's quite sure that several countries, like also in France, but also in Portugal, and we are in the crossing road. And definitely we need to change how we want to manage these big problems. The big problem also for me is the way that fire detection and fire response measure receive greater attention and resources than fire prevention and preparedness, and also post-fire restorations and adaptation measures. That for me is a big problem, because even if in the fire risk management strategy, we say that, okay, we need also to have a big we need to pay attention about fire restoration and post-fire restoration, and also fire preparedness and preventions. Most resource is allocated to firefighting. That's the big issues. So that's why I think that this situation cannot be viable, and we need to change the strategy. And so without an ambitious fire prevention and preparedness strategy associated with the post-fire restorations, that complementing the already operative fire detections and fire risk management mechanism, Europe will have to provide billions of euros per year in perpetuity to deal with the problem of forest fire. And also, we need also to take into account that we must consider that most forested ecosystem in Europe, but I think also in other parts in the world, will burn. And during the following decades, and we must anticipate and prepare for these situations. We cannot just say, okay, we will have some strategy for post-fire. I think that we need to go before and to anticipate and to prepare for the situations. But we need to know where the situation will be very problematic. So we need to have some information about the area or the zone in a fire risk situations that will be very problematic. So where fire will be very severe, where the situation could be very dramatic according to a social aspect, but also ecological aspect. And we need, I think for me, the best strategy is to anticipate, not to come after the fire, so to be before the fire and try to manage the ecosystem properly. And this is also a need for develop scientific-based guidelines for post-fire restoration measures that take into account local, environmental, and socio-economic contexts. And the main thing is to upgrade the resilience of the ecosystem toward fire. And also, we know we can have some kind of opposite goal when we deal with post-fire restoration, or that we say fire risk management. So we need to manage and to see the trade-off between environmental and local environmental issue and socio-economic and the socio-economic context. It's very important to discuss about this trade-off between socio-economic context and environmental context. And the main thing is also, when you've made some kind of logging, we need also to take into account that this logging need to put in the bucket the way that we can reduce the fire risk, and also how we can improve the resilience of the ecosystem, and also how we can just perhaps in some place increase the biodiversity. The main things that I think that the government and some countries need to develop as a strategy, the budget allocated to post-fire restoration, or that I say before, to anticipate and to prepare for this situation, must be separate and ring fingers to whatever the conclusion about the debate of financial support of fire risk management. We need to separate the budget, because each time, because people just think about, okay, it's more comfortable, and people, some country need to know that resources is allocated to firefighting, more aircraft, more firefighters. But when we arrive to this situation of restoration and preparedness, the the budget is like smelt, no enough money, and we just say, okay, we need to have more money for fighting. So I think that we need to separate in the budget of fire risk management the allocated resource related to restoration and preparedness and awareness. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. We might go straight to our next speaker and have questions at the end. I've noticed people are putting questions into the Q&A, which is fantastic. We will come back to these questions at the end, so please keep them coming. Our next speaker is Florent Mouillot, who is Head of Forecast, the Centre of Functional and Evolutionary Ecology. So Florent works on Mediterranean ecosystems and looks at the impact of global changes on the functioning of vegetation and landscape dynamics, their impact on water resources and exchanges with the atmosphere. So over to you, Florent. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Florent Mouillot. I'm based in Montpellier at the Centre d'écologie fonctionnelle et evolutive. And I will show you today our work in the team about fire management, the increasing drought in Mediterranean ecosystem. And I will show some data, experiment, and models that we are using in a group. So the main topic of our team and the main scientific objective are to understand how the forest functions under the climate constraint. So we have a landmark in the team, which is a Chabon study site that you have the picture in the background, which is an olm oak forest, an evergreen forest, where we study all the ecophysiology of the trees, the functioning and the exchange with the atmosphere, the water and carbon budgets. And we have another group, another guy, Xavier Morin, working on the biodiversity, that how species interact within stands and how these species affect the ecosystem. And I'm particularly working on the impact of fires on this ecosystem, and our goal are to understand both the climate and some management plans and what are the effects on the functioning of all these interactions. So I will present the first task of our group, which is the forest functioning under climate change and management. So we have a study site that we call Chabon, which is a small village, where we have a long-term experimental site since 1984. So you can see on the right panel all the experiments we have in place and part of some international fundings like ICOS and ANAE, the European perspective. So we have a flex tower to monitor all the exchange with the atmosphere, and we have some rainfall exclusion experiments with some gutters intercepting 30% of the rainfall on the right panel here. And we have also some management experiments where we process to some clearing, some thinning of the forest to understand how forest management could affect the functioning of the ecosystem. So all the data we have are all this water, tree functioning, ecophysiology data. And recently we developed a few moisture content database for trees and all the shrubs and herbaceous layers. And all this data were part of the Globe Live Few Moisture database from Marta Yebra, published recently. And we have this tree thinning management experiment where we try to understand how we could play on the water budget and carbon budget of the ecosystem. So our scientific objectives are mostly to understand how we could mitigate climate change impact by management, both on the seasonal, yearly, and even long-term and decadal timescales. So just an example of the type of research we can do on this kind of ecosystem. I showed here on the left panel the tree growth, the stem growth of the trees in the black line, and how it was related to the predominant water potential, which is basically the drought of the ecosystem. And we show that the stem growth was stopped during the droughts. But as soon as the drought reached a certain threshold that we call T1, And we, on the right panel, we showed how we could play with tree cover by reducing tree density and the leaf area index. We could modify the start of the drought period and control the droughts and the growth of the ecosystem. And that was an interesting result to how management could play on drought, biomass available, and in turn fire risk. The second task we have been working on is more the mixed shrubland functioning. Like Mediterranean ecosystem are mostly composed of mixed shrublands. And we did an experiment that was based in Tunisia, in North Africa, a few years ago, in the European project FUME, where we had this rainfall interception experiment on plots of 8 by 8 meters and an experimental burning. And here, so we measured also the specific water fluxes in plants with 5 species altogether. So we had the daily soil content, the weekly fuel moisture content, and plant functioning. And we could compare the pre-fire and the post-fire plant functioning. So here we had to, we tried to understand the different strategies of the species to cope with droughts and how the species were interacting for soil water use. And we had all this data to benchmark some functional models. And the idea was to propose this tool, this modeling tool, to do some biodiversity manipulation for post-fire and pre-fire management to reduce fire risk. So some example of the data we have here, 2 contrasted species, Erica and Fiderea, 2 main species in the shrublands, where you could see on the top left panel the different water use for the same soil water content that the plants were desiccating differently. And we could compare the live fuel moisture content as a function of this predawn water potential, which is the true water deficit in the plant. So the idea was to manage species clearing in fuel breaks based on their water functioning and to drive the decision makers. So we also have this model that I published a long time ago now, in 2001, which is the Sierra model, which is a model with the main objective was to simulate the competition for water and light, but mostly the water. And we have all this data to benchmark this model, and this model can be used as a numerical tool to manage biodiversity and try to propose decisions to reduce fire risk. So the last task I wanted to talk about is the landscape scale fire monitoring. So I've been working recently both in France and North Africa, and what I call Middle East and North Africa, so Algeria, Tunisia, and Syria and Lebanon. And I've been working on developing a fire contour database, fire polygon database from remote sensing in all these countries. From Landsat data, so 30-meter resolution. So we have now a full data set in 1985 for all these countries. On the other side, I've been working recently in a European project from the European Space Agency, where we have been working on the global remote sensing with MODIS MCD64 and the recent ESA data Fire CCI. And my goal here was to produce from the pixel burn date, was to aggregate this pixel into fire patches. So we have produced in 2018 the FRI database, which is the global fire patch morphology that covers also Australia. Indeed, it's a global data set. And we are preparing the version 2 with the new data set at 250-meter resolution from the Fire CCI data set. So why did I focus on this? Because I think that getting all this data set on fire location can be a useful tool for fire hazard analysis, fire selectivity, so where are fires on topography, vegetation, whatsoever, but also to understand the post-fire vegetation on the long term. Once we have this data and the recent forest inventory, for example, we can do some synchronic and diachronic analysis to understand how the vegetation can regrow, depending on the fire recurrence, the fire shape, the fire size, and depending also on topography and microclimate. So I'm using also all this data for the impact studies on hydrology and carbon budget. So this is the example of what we get from this. So I've been working on Google Earth Engine with Landsat data to compute the pre-fire and the post-fire indices, like the normalized burn ratio and NDVI. And we got semi-automated methods so that I can check visually if my polygons are actually representing the true fire shape. So I produced this data for all the south of France, so both what we call the Prometheus database, the southeast, where all the fires are referenced by for fire services, but also the southwest, where we have also some fires. So I also prepared the data set for Tunisia down there in pink from 1985, and we recently published all this database with the interesting thing that happened in Tunisia recently, which is the Tunisian revolution, where we could see that the fires increased by times 6 recently due to social troubles, and we could figure here since 2011 that new areas were burned that were not burned in the past 30 years. So that was an interesting database which do not exist even for France. Actually, this homogeneous database doesn't exist, and it's really an important information to get for post-fire management also.
1 minute, Florent.
Yes, I'm done. So I just wanted to show this recent paper from Bowman that Australia needs a national monitoring agency. So I think also that France and military also need this information for post-fire management understanding. So my last slide, just to show all the ongoing activities and projects, and you can see the website where you can find all the data and information I just talked in my speech. I'm done. I hope I wasn't dying.
Perfect timing. Thank you very much, Florent. So our next speaker, and thank you for the questions, keep them coming. Our next speaker is Adam Leavesley. Adam is a bushfire manager with a strong focus on using science and research in bushfire management. He's the editor of a recently released book called Prescribed Burning in Australasia, Science, Practice and Politics of Burning the Bush. He's an Australian representative on the Global Wildfire Information Systems Program at the European Commission Joint Research Centre, as well as many other achievements. So over to you. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I want to start by thanking all the French speakers for your English language proficiency. I can't speak any French and we wouldn't be able to exchange, and I imagine it's not easy trying to unpick all the different accents, and thank you very much for that. I've in my daily life, the most common French cultural experience that I have is from my son watching Ladybird, and she's on the screen there, and she's there to thank you on every slide for the effort that you're putting in. But the other reason that Ladybird is on there is because as a superhero, she wins her battles using her intellect and outwitting the villain. And at the end of the show, she redeems the villains and turns everything to good. And I think that's a little bit of an analogy of the way that we of what we're doing today and the approach that we're taking today. So the question that I was asked to look at in terms of restoration, you can answer it pretty quickly and easily. In fire-prone landscapes of Australia, there's not a great deal that we do to restore the landscape. And the reason for that is that Australian landscapes, many Australian landscapes evolved with fire, and they have attributes that respond to fire, so that the landscape restores itself. I mean, the picture that I've put up for you to see, I don't see that as a negative picture. There's a lot of the ground cover was removed during the last fire in the ACT 5 or 6 months ago now, but it was very dry when it burnt. But if you look up into the trees where I'm pointing with the mouse, you can see that the canopy, although those leaves are dead and they've been scorched, they weren't consumed, which means this wasn't burnt very hot. And that image to me isn't an image which has anything negative in it. It's part and parcel of a landscape that burns, that is maintained partly by burning, and there's nothing inherently bad in what you see there. To progress that idea a little bit further, I've got the same picture on the left of your screen. In the middle of the screen, there's a photo I took in 2012. So it was 9 years after the last Canberra fires in 2003. They burnt a lot hotter than the ones in 2020. And you can see there's lots of dead branches on that tree. And that indicates to me that the fire burnt through here very, very hot. And I know that it did. The canopy hasn't restored, so that those dead branches are sticking out further than what the tree presently is gathering light from. And we do know, because of course I'm underneath when I'm taking that photo, that the amount of shrub cover on the ground is much higher. So this landscape has been changed. The tree is still alive, but this landscape has been changed, and you'd expect slightly different structure. The other, the picture on the right, is a different situation again. So that's following a prescribed burn in April 2019, 1 year after burning. And you can see that in that case, the fire has burnt along the ground. It's removed the shrub layer and the litter layer, but it hasn't affected the canopy. So in this location, actually, the wildfire was unable to penetrate into here, and that's a part of the landscape that remains unburnt following the fire. And so what we can do with prescribed burning is potentially to modify the fire regime, which is being changed by climate change, in ways that will help us to preserve the values that the values we've identified in the forests. Here's an example of what happens, or this shows you what happened during January and February 2020 of this year. On the left, the lighter areas of that image are where we run the prescribed burn in April 2019. And the yellow sections are where the fire front that actually was ignited, where that little green dot is. The yellow sections are the fire front heading in a northwest direction, and you can see when it's approached the area of the prescribed burn that it hasn't penetrated far and has gone out. It's broken up the fire front, and it's prevented the spread in the northwesterly direction. You can see further down where my mouse is pointing, that on the areas that weren't fuel reduced in 2019, the fire intensity is much higher, and then it is an older burn right in the corner where again fire intensity is much higher. If you turn to the picture on the right, the green's showing areas that didn't burn, and there's considerable agreement between those areas and the area that and what was burnt in 2019. The yellow is relatively low severity, and the red is very high severity. And I'll show you a little bit of what that looks like from a photo. So the white arrow showing the hillside, you follow that over and you can see that hillside that was burnt very hot during the wildfire. But what we've done in the areas that were burnt in 2019 is to modify the fire regime, reduce the overall intensity of the fire, and to help preserve some of the values that we recognise in the forest. One of the problems of burning the landscape to try to modify the fire regime is that it's hard if you're working in an annually following the human administrative budgets. Every year you might burn 3,000 hectares, 5,000 hectares. If you don't get a wildfire, then you're not getting the benefit in the changing of the fire regime, as much benefit as you would have if there's an intersection between the prescribed burn and the wildfire. And what I think we might be able to do in Australia to make greater positive change in fire regimes, to move away from the greater frequency of high intensity fires, is to try to surge our burning effort when we know that the landscape is in the condition that will allow it, or makes it much more likely that a wildfire will occur. So in my view, the way to restore or to manage the landscape, we need to try to do what we can to manage the fire regimes, so that we have a landscape that has the values within it that we prioritise and have identified. So we must define the aims of land management, try to modify the fire regime to try to deliver those aims, and then something we haven't tried in Australia, surge the prescribed burning effort when we know that the landscape is becoming very dry, in order to have the maximum area burnt at the time that the wildfire is most likely to happen. And that's Ladybug there, determined to do something better and improve the situation. And that's my talk.
Fantastic. Thanks, Adam, and keeping very well to time. So our next speaker is Professor Tina Bell. Tina is from the University of Sydney, and she's a project leader in the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC. Tina explores the effects of fire size on carbon, water and vegetation structure and composition. And I notice in Tina's CV that she's also studied the recovery of key physiological processes of grapevines, smoke. So given that it's an Australian and a French collaboration, I think we might want to have a conversation about the importance of grapevines. But over to you, Tina. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen here. I would like to firstly acknowledge the lands that I'm coming from, the Indigenous lands. I'm coming from the Darug and Ku-ring-gai lands north of Sydney. Thank you to all the speakers beforehand. You've set my presentation up beautifully. I hope that I can do your presentations justice as well. As Kathy introduced me, we're working with the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC and looking at how prescribed burning that was described by Adam so beautifully, how we can get carbon and water and vegetation outcomes, restoration of vegetation after fires, how we can get more understanding of the maximising those benefits with prescribed burning. I'm going to go through two examples. There's many examples I could have used, of course, just to show you how the importance of gaining new knowledge is. We all know that generally, but in the context I'm going to show you how we don't rest on our laurels. We keep trying to understand the vegetation and how we can incorporate new technologies in our science. So this is a picture I often show. Eucalypt species, the difference of how they recover after fire. On the left is a stand of mountain ash or Eucalyptus regnans that was burnt in a wildfire. This was from 2006. Underneath the dead stems, because they are killed by fire, there's a beautiful crop of new seedlings coming up. That's going to be the next generation of that particular species. These are called ash-type eucalypts, and in Australia there's about 680,000 hectares of these kind of forests, which doesn't seem too much, but they're very important because they're associated with water catchments, and that will become apparent in a little bit in a moment. On the right is a different type of regeneration strategy for eucalypts. This is what most of the eucalypt species, in fact, this is how they regenerate. They lose their canopy in intense wildfires that goes up into the crown, but they've got the capacity to resprout after fire. Clearly this tree is not dead. It's covered in epicormic sprouts, so little buds that's protected by the bark overlying underneath the meristematic buds that the bark is protecting it. And this kind of eucalypt forest, mixed species eucalypt forest, is much more prevalent. It's about 3 million, over 3 to 4 million hectares across Australia. So clearly that's the main type of vegetation response, when we're talking about eucalypt trees, just as important as the fire sensitive species. So we have a classic picture of ash type species that are killed by fire. Their response is that fire intolerant. If anything above about 70% of the canopy is scorched, then that's the death knell of individual trees. They respond after a fire by mass germination. And as an example, there's plenty of examples in the literature, but one site that we measured, we had a lot of students at the time, in excess of 12,000 seedlings per hectare as understory. And overstory of that same spot, the mature species, the mature individuals was about 70 stems per hectare. This is a classic response, classic type of densities of ash type eucalypts. The graph on the right shows for both mountain ash and alpine ash, the two ash type species that I'm talking about here. Densities after fire are incredibly high. This is some information taken from a number of classic studies in Australia. As the years go by, self-thinning occurs, and once you get to about forests of about 40, 60 years, that's the final densities. So very high mass germination of seedlings. The seedlings, they sort themselves out, and eventually you've got the mature forests of much lower density. Because of that response after fire, these vegetation types, ash type forests, they're often managed because of the water yield and runoff from the catchments that they form. So for example, in Victoria, the water catchments that supply Melbourne and surrounding areas of the major city of Victoria, they are populated by ash type forests. So you can imagine if a fire came through those areas, that the water supply to the towns and cities around Melbourne is going to be compromised. I'll go through that a little bit more and explain it. So classic work by Vertesi has shown that, and associates has shown that immediately after a fire, so time zero, the age of the forest, because of that really high density of seedlings, the death of the mature species, the mature individuals, until they start, the seedlings start to grow, there's actually a high yield. That understory of seedlings with very high density starts to use the water to grow, to increase their leaf area, and they need that water instead of it going into the catchments. So for a period of anywhere between 20 to 40 or 60 years after a fire, the yield from catchments in ash type forests, once they've been burnt or in fact clear felled, the yield to catchments is much lower, and it takes quite some time for that yield to increase as the forest ages. So knowing that, these catchments in Victoria and ACT and Tasmania are managed accordingly. So fire is more or less excluded from these areas to prevent the forest from being burnt and compromising water supplies. But new research just come out. It's in the October edition of the journal. My apologies, I forgot to write the journal down there. Has shown that in Tasmania, where there's also ash type species, there's a number of there's much greater resilience, and rather than being this fire intolerant species, the subspecies of alpine ash, you can actually recover by resprouting. So that really changes the whole idea of what is a fire intolerant species that is managed for water catchment. Of course, there's a lot of caveats around that. For example, trees, these alpine ash trees have to be a certain size. They have to be greater than 20 centimeters dBH to be able to recover by resprouting. But this work and work around this, it's not a new phenomenon, but this work here shows that fire intolerant species that are very important for ecosystem services, such as providing water for cities, are much more resilient than perhaps originally thought. So that changes the way in which these forests can actually be managed. And a bit of work that our group has done shows exactly how that's regrowth vegetation of these species that can resprout by regeneration from sprouts use much less water than their mature counterparts. Okay, I've got to jump up here. The second thing we're looking at is new technology, looking at how intense fires may be. A lot of ground truthing to match up with burn severity mapping, which Adam showed you, is done by subjective means, colour of ash, depth of ash, things like that. What we're exploring here is using near-infrared spectroscopy to try and take out the guesswork or the subjectivity of these kind of ground truthing measures. We're a long way off, but we have these visions of taking handheld NIR spectrometers out in the field, looking at the types of ash, for example, up here, and being able to get an idea of what temperature was actually formed, that ash residue was formed at. And that will give us a much more accurate idea of fire severity, which has got important implications for carbon loss from systems and recovery of ecosystems after fire. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Tina, and thank you to all our speakers. I might just pull up the Q&A questions. We've got a couple of questions to answer. But before I do that, I'm very keen to hear from our four panelists on whether you identified during those talks some research gaps that you think could be tackled jointly. Did anyone notice anything? I noticed one of the common themes was around fire prevention and being prepared for fires. The idea of surging fires and the intersection of prescribed burning and bushfires. Is there any research that needs to be done in that space, or are we comfortable that we know what we're doing in that area?
Kathy, it's Adam Leavesley. Certainly, prescribed burning, I'm certain that prescribed burning will become very important for managing forests into the future, but certainly 15 or 20 years ago, I would have had a lot less certainty. I would have expressed a lot less certainty in relation to that, and I'm become more and more convinced that climate change is going to mean that we have much higher frequency of much more intense fires, and I think that's going. So I'm talking about using fire with a lot more certainty in relation to the fact that I believe that we are going to see considerable change due to climate change. And the idea around surging the capacity is a new idea. It's something that you would probably try to test using a fire regime simulation model. You'd insert into the simulation model some metric of climate of landscape dryness, and then test to see whether surging your effort to burn will give you better bang for your buck in terms of burning. So that's an idea that I've had in Australia. I'm not sure in France and French territories whether or not prescribed burning can be deployed in the same way as it is in Australia. But if you were looking to do that in France, I would suggest that there could be value in looking at looking to try to increase it when the landscape is drier.
Florent, Adam, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, I think that prescribed burning could be very useful, but the main issue when you use, I think that the prescribed burning could be very useful, and the main thing that we can use a large territory with prescribed burning, but in the Mediterranean context, with shrub and something like that, with no very tall trees, is not so easy. Look like that we have with eucalyptus in Australia, because here the density and the main vegetation in the Mediterranean context is related to a high density of shrubs, and it's not easy for me that we can use prescribed burning as we can use it in Australia with the eucalyptus trees. So I don't know, but I think that is very useful. It's quite sure that we can use it for a large territory to remove the fuel loads, but I don't know.
Thank you, Adam. I'm just having a look at some of the questions that have come in. Larissa has said she's a freshly trained environmental practitioner, and she's saying fog collectors can be used to water the landscape and fight forest fires. And Australia also has a long history of controlling fire risk using traditional methodologies. How can I be involved in the collaboration? Is there any room in this collaboration for use of traditional knowledge?
I'd say absolutely. We need to have all the methods we can for preventing uncontrolled fires. And if that means using culture burning practices, not necessarily to reduce fuel loads, because there's certain places where it's appropriate and where it's not, but using cultural practices to inform the public, to bring a greater audience to how fire can be used to manage the landscape is it's one of the strongest tools that we'll have, as well as prescribed burning done under operational levels as well. That we had a prescribed burn going here earlier today. So any method that improves awareness and effectiveness, absolutely.
And a suggestion for how a young researcher can get involved? It's a tricky one. I think within Australia, reaching out to local universities to see who's doing research in the area would be a good place to start. It is something that I hope we discuss, whether there might be any opportunities for Australian-French collaboration and exchange of students. I think there would be great opportunity to share ideas and share expertise through student exchange and postdoc exchange as well.
I'll go for there again. I support that as well. Just if you look at the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC webpage for students, I did that the other day and thought there was an extraordinary number of PhD students that have finished their degrees or are finishing their degrees, as well as associate students as well. So having the capacity of research agencies such as the CRC and what's set up in France that have student involvement like that has got to be useful as well.
So Bertrand asks, what are the recommendations for landscape recovery after fire, to let natural recovery go by itself, or to organise and implement more fire-resistant species? Adam, that's something that you touched on where you might want to expand a little bit on that. Should we be thinking about fire-resistant species?
Well, within the urban areas in Australia, certainly that is the case. So at the interface between the fire-prone area and the urban area where people are living, there's certainly been and there continues to be reform that reduces in particular plants that will throw embers, because the fire comes up to the urban interface and then throws embers, sometimes hundreds of meters into the city. And if buildings have anything on them that will can catch a light, then you can find fires popping up all over the city. And to some degree, not quite as I've described then, but to some degree, that's what happened in 2003 in Canberra. But the issue of trying to change the bush in Australia, that would be a very serious question that probably I think would take many years of conversation across the community. In Australia, a relatively recent colonisation, to call it what it is, by Europeans, we tend to think about managing our conservation land by hands off, and to go into conservation land and make big changes like even prescribed burning. There's suspicion in some sections of the community, and that's without deliberately causing changes to the species composition. So look, it's a very difficult question in terms of forest and forest lands, but certainly in non-conservation land, just what the question describes is what presently is happening in Australia.
Sebastian mentioned that earlier in the week there was a presentation about prescribed burning in France, and the method and scale are different to what is done in Australia. Urban connectivity is more challenging than the type of fuel. And that's kind of interesting for me as I think about koalas, because you know, we're finding that koalas like to live in the same locations as we do, and koalas are quite, you know, often found close to towns and villages. And I guess the ability to do prescribed burns in locations like that can sometimes be a little bit more challenging. Tina mentioned prescribed burning in Sydney today. There's still a lot of controversy around that, isn't there? And, you know, what are the issues that we need to be thinking of, or what are the policies that are making that prescribed burning near highly densely populated areas?
The key issue with prescribed burning in conservation land is that the community is not entirely comfortable with the practice, thinking that it will potentially change the bush, as I tried to describe before. But there is another really important issue as well that I need to mention, and that is the production of smoke. And you know, smoke is hazardous to populations, and throwing smoke across cities is not tenable. It's another conversation that our communities must have. We have to come to an agreement, a social agreement, a license, a social license across Australian communities that that the amount of smoke that comes from a wildfire like what happened this 2020 season that was choking and the worst air quality in the world, for example, in the city I live in, Canberra, which generally has the very best air quality in the world, we have to get an agreement that we're going to minimise, we're going to have a negative impact on air quality when we're burning, but with the expectation that that will minimise the much more negative impacts that can come of wildfires, and that conversation is still to come.
Fantastic. I'm very much aware of time, and we have run out of time, although I do have more questions and there are still more questions on the chat. So our speakers, if you are able, feel free to answer some questions if they're relevant for you. Thank you to Adam and to Florent and to Tina for giving us a fantastic overview of this area. I hope it leads to some collaborations, and I hope people reach out to our speakers if you would like to work with them.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you to all of our panelists in that session. I think for me, there are a couple of questions that we probably didn't get to that maybe just are things we need to think about. And the first one is one that as science-trained folk, we need to think about often. And that's what we need to do to be able to get global attention on what we're doing so that we can focus the intention on prevention and minimising damage rather than trying to fix it up afterwards. So there is something that comes about how we tell our story and what story we tell. And the other comes, I think, is well illustrated by some of what Adam said towards the end. We talk a lot about the things that we value. And if I was to ask everybody who's on the call today, on the webinar today, to list the 10 top things that they most value in the life and the environment around them, everybody's list would be different to everybody else's. And that is the conundrum that we face, that when people say, I like to live amongst trees, there's others that say I like to burn and not want to have my house done. And it's the way we can have the data to support that, and how we can have those conversations to work out what it is that we truly need to have, because we cannot satisfy everybody's need for their own values, because that's just an impossibility. So thank you to panel one. That was a really good way to kick off tonight. And now I would like I guess to introduce myself as chair for the second panel tonight. As I said before, I'm the research director at the Bushfire Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre. I look after the portfolio of the centre, and areas like this and communicating is hugely important. And one of the things that is really important for a research centre like ours is to have a forward vision and to be trying to look at and understand future risks. What are the things that we need to be prepared for? What and in what ways can research help us be prepared for those things, and even to understand what those future risks might be. And we brought together a really good panel of people for tonight. We have, in fact, two people from New Caledonia for the first time in the webinar, so welcome. A couple of researchers from Australia, and we finish off with a representative from France from a meteorological perspective. So I might introduce Dr. Adrien Bertaud and Mr. Fabien Albuoy from the Observatory of the Environment in New Caledonia. Adrien will do the presentation for us today, and he's the head of the Environment Unit of the Observatory for Environment in New Caledonia. As part of his training for sustainable management of coastal ecosystems, he participated in various research projects before taking part in environmental policy implementation in the mining project. He's done a 2-year mission to Australia on aquaculture project, and he joined the observatory in New Caledonia in 2011, taking charge of optimising biodiversity monitoring indicators and fulfilling the essential mission to properly support environmental management policies. And that meets his personal goal of serving ecosystems conservation in New Caledonia. And Fabien, who will join us in the discussion and the Q&A at the end, is the director of the observatory. Is an engineer by training, a specialist in geographical information systems, and he's led projects in many parts of the world, in France, in West Africa, and now in New Caledonia, and he's been director of the observatory since 2019. So Adrien, we'll pass over to you, and if you could please tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges facing New Caledonia.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to share our work. There's probably be a misunderstanding. I'm not a doctor and we're not really a researcher. In fact, we are scientists and we monitor the environment. But really our approach is really applied to monitoring the environment. So with all due modesty, we come here to present our work. I hope it will get your interest. So today I'm going to talk about our contribution to bushfires monitoring and environmental impact assessment in New Caledonia and future risks. So the first slide about our mission. We work for an observatory, so obviously we monitor the environment. This is our main mission. And the information we produce are broadcasted to our stakeholders. We study bushfires and their effects, but not only, we also study exploitation mining and its consequences on the environment, erosion, etc. So this is one of the topics that we're studying. Here on this slide, I just wanted to throw a little map of New Caledonia for those who don't really locate it. So we are about 1,000 kilometers away from the east coast of Australia, and this is a French territory, as you can notice from my accent. So New Caledonia is a biodiversity hotspot. We have more than 3,000 species of plants with high endemic rates. More than 75% of our plants are endemic. Some of them are micro-endemic. We find them only in some summits. So they are really vulnerable to bushfires, obviously. We have a unique and threatened terrestrial fauna. About 90% of our lizards are endemic. Almost all of them are threatened of extinction. And New Caledonia is also a place where you can find about 1/3 of the pristine coral reefs known in the world. So a rich biodiversity, and beside it, bushfires is one of the main environmental pressure in New Caledonia. So we're talking about 10 to 40,000 hectares per year that are burnt, affected by bushfires. 99% of them are triggered by human. So this is mainly due to the usage of fire for agricultural practices, for instance. And here I just wanted to show you a map. So this is from a research project that has been conducted a few years ago. And this model gave the potential forest cover without the human presence in New Caledonia. So you can see that without the human, there would be about 80% of forest cover. And right now you've got the map for the current forest cover, which is less than half of this, 35%. And scientists concluded that bushfires are one of the main drivers that brought us to this situation here in New Caledonia. However, we have a real lack of reliable data to manage bushfires here, probably due to the fact that we are a relatively small country, and also because we have few means in terms of firefighting. So our contribution since 2016 is to monitor bushfires for our stakeholders and assist bushfire management. In 2019, we have 14% of the first bushfire alert that was received by the firefighting department was provided by our services. How do we do so? Well, we exclusively rely on free satellite imagery. Here you have the different satellite data that we use. Obviously, depending on the characteristics of each satellite, we have different use for the information given. But this allows us to develop three types of services: geographical portal, a personalized fire alert system, and specific bushfire monitoring for New Caledonia. Just a word about our geographical portal. So it gathers fire data and local environment data, and it allows to do very advanced analysis and answer precise questions, such as what type of vegetation has been affected in the South Province of New Caledonia for the last 5 years, sorry. And all the detailed results are given in this geoportal in forms of tables and charts, and everything can be downloaded. Obviously, all the topics can be treated, such as protected areas affected by fires, threatened species, etc. Whatever data we have is crossed and analyzed into this platform. We also deliver a single email personalized fire alert system. It's based on a single email alert subscription service. What is remarkable is that we're trying to compile all the satellite information we have from Modis Sumin and Himawari, the Japanese satellite, in this system. And the user can select his criteria in terms of geography, thematic, temporal, and basically we'll receive an email containing simple information. This is linked to our geoportal to produce more advanced analysis. We also produce a bushfire monitoring. So we analyze the SUMI's data for constant immediate monitoring. So basically we just use the hotspots from SUMI to outline the fires. So we've just set up some criteria, some rules about distance between the hotspots and time of operation of these hotspots. And this is used to produce a first environmental assessment crossing these potentially burned areas with different environmental data. We also do a more accurate monitoring using another type of satellite image, which is from the satellite Sentinel-2. So this is from the European Special Agency program Copernicus. These images are quite precise. We're talking about 10 meters pixel. And we have developed an automated processing chain with our partner Insight in 2016-2017 to outline, to produce the detection of fires, of burnt areas. So this is post-fire detection. And this is remarkable in the sense that we are analyzing all the data, all the images, sorry, that are available for New Caledonia. So we're talking about 18,000 square kilometers surface, and we are analyzing more than 1,000 images a year to produce that more accurate monitoring and environmental assessments of the impacts of bushfires in New Caledonia. So we do it once per year. It started in 2017. Now about future risks, and these are the results from our colleagues, a researcher in the Institute of Research and Development here in Nouméa. There's been only a single study specific to Nouméa about climate change, and you have the full reference here on your screen. And this is based on the downscaling approach from the model for climate change that was produced by the IPCC, so the International Panel for Climate Change. All the results I'm going to present to you are based on the scenario where greenhouse gases emissions are stable. So this is so here on this slide you have the rainfall evolution. On your right, the map presents you the difference between future and present in terms of percent. So what we can see is globally, so its future is in 100 years. So we are in the year 2100. So in about 100 years, the results show that there will be globally a decrease of 20% of rainfall. Huge contrast between the east and the west part of the island, also between the north and the south. Most of the decrease in precipitation will happen during the warm season. On this slide, we're talking about temperature forecast. So the results of this study says that in about 100 years, we'll face 3 degrees increase in temperature globally. And once more, you have this contrast between east and west. This part of the results is about heat waves. So nowadays we have something like 10 to 20 days of heat waves a year. And it is forecasted that in 100 years, we will face more than 120 days of heat waves per year, which is huge. They've used these results to forecast what would be the forest fire weather index. So this is the index produced by the Canadian meteorology services. On the top, the map that you have is the present situation. On the bottom one, it's the forecast in year 2100. So we can see that on the west coast of New Caledonia, we will double the risk of fire. And you can see that lots of areas that were before at low risk of fire will become at high risk. So we're talking about potential destruction of our relictual forests in New Caledonia. And there is really a different type of ecosystems here. We don't really have, our native forests are not adapted to bushfires. And they grow really slowly because of the specific geology in New Caledonia. Of course, all those results have been obtained without considering human factors such as future demography or land use. And we know that human trigger bushfires. So this is obviously something that that should be taken into account. To conclude, well, we've started a monitoring work here in our observatory, and the first assessment of their environmental impacts. But we could certainly improve this work. First of all, we need complementary knowledge about the effect of bushfires on the wildlife, on the different ecosystem. We don't have this kind of studies here. We could also try to use new technologies such as radar, especially when we have a huge cloud cover. That could be helpful. About future risks, they seem very high in the context of climate change, but finally we just have one study specific to New Caledonia, so really we don't have much information, and there is still lots to study about the potential effect of this climate change on and their effect on bushfires and their effect on the ecosystem. And we're open to collaborate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Adrien. We might move on now to our next presenter to keep the session moving. Our next presenter is Professor Holger Maier. Holger is a professor in the School of Civil and Environmental and Mining Engineering at the University of Adelaide, and is a researcher for the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC. His research is focused on developing improved techniques for the sustainable management of infrastructure and natural resources, including natural hazards in an uncertain environment. And I think without further ado, I'll pass over to Holger to look at the way he's exploring future risk. Thank you, Holger.
Thank you very much, John, for the introduction. So I'd like to share my screen and start my presentation. So my talk today is really looking at understanding future bushfire risk and also how we can, what the best approaches are to managing that risk. I'd like to start with this quote, which I really use often, because it's really, when we're thinking about future risk, you know, a lot of that future risk is a function of decisions we make today. And so, you know, in order to keep that in mind, we need to not only look at risk at the present moment, but think about the trajectory into the future and how we can then build a pathway to a more resilient future. When we're thinking about risk as well, it's really important to keep in mind that risk is a function of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And that's really just depicted here by the risk triangle. And so obviously we need a fire, or we need the hazard for there to be risk. Without fire, there's no risk, but also if nothing of value is exposed to that fire, then there's also no risk. And that's really the exposure part of the risk triangle. So, you know, it's really talking about the people, the wildlife, the environmental assets, the infrastructure that's exposed to that hazard. But even if some of these things we care about are exposed to the hazard, the impact or the damage or the loss is really a function of the attributes of those people or those things that are exposed. And that's really the vulnerability. So it's a social vulnerability, environmental vulnerability, and building vulnerability. So all of these things act together to give us the overall risk associated with a bushfire. But I think in practice, it's less a risk triangle, but more of a risk iceberg, because a lot of the focus is on the hazard side of things. You know, and you just have to look at all the news stories and even what happened in Australia last summer. It's all about the fire and how can we reduce the impact of fires? How can we manage the fires? But when you think about risk as a whole, you know, these other parts sometimes have more impact on the losses and the damage, but they're not very much front and center. And they're not front and center partly because exposure and vulnerability develop as part of community values. You know, people don't choose to live in a bushfire prone area because it's bushfire prone. They choose to live there because they either have no choice or because it's a beautiful place to live. You know, they might have people like living in the bush. And so it's a really, you know, and so that exposure and vulnerability, tend to grow over time, but almost by stealth. You know, we don't think about those things as creating future risk They just happen because of complex interaction between our values. And so there's a very low awareness of that part of the equation in terms of risk. And then when we think about future risk, then we need to think about how all of these aspects change over time. And that was touched upon in the previous presentation, that obviously climate change affects the hazard, and that, as we all know, that increases fire intensity and severity, all these sorts of things. Wind speeds are changing. But at the same time, exposure is changing as well. So as populations grow, as we develop our economies, we increase the value and we increase the number of people and assets that are exposed to the hazard or the fire. And also vulnerability changes over time. So for example, volunteer rates might change because of different cultural compositions or different demographics. And also we might have an aging population, which might increase vulnerability. And then when you think about mitigation and how do we actually reduce future risk, you also need to think about all these three components of risk. And that's actually a good thing because it opens up more options for us. So rather than just focusing on the hazard part, which is for example, the prescribed burning we've talked about already today, the fuel load reduction, that's obviously one important aspect of changing future risk, but also spatial planning can be used to, I guess, think about, where do people live? Do they live in bushfire prone areas? And similarly, vulnerability can be affected by looking at building codes or materials that are used in buildings and other factors, and also community education. So really, when we're thinking about future risk and how to manage that, it's important to look at it holistically and think about all the factors that affect that risk. So really what we've done is as part of a project funded by the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC over the last 6 years, we've co-developed, we've worked with more than 40 government agencies in 4 states in Australia, in Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia to develop a decision support system to really help people explore and better understand those factors of risks and how they might change into the future, and also how effective different mitigation strategies might be. And so that decision support system is called UNHARMED, which stands for Unified Natural Hazard Risk Mitigation Exploratory Decision Support System. So the way UNHARMED works is we basically have spatial representation of each of these factors affecting risk, so each part of the risk triangle. So for example, in terms of the hazard, you can see here is a fire intensity map for the Adelaide model. You then overlay exposure layer, so the land use. And on top of that, you can look at the things you care about. So in this case, it's the building stock, but you could equally have environmental assets or social vulnerability, all sorts of different factors that basically sit on top of that land use. And then that basically, in this case, each of these buildings has a particular vulnerability to bushfire. And so that's captured by these vulnerability curves. So you can see here on the x-axis, we have basically the intensity or magnitude of the hazard, so that'll be the fire intensity. And on the y-axis, we have the impact or the damage. So in this case, it's normalized between 0, meaning no damage, and 1 being complete destruction. And so obviously the shape of that curve is a function of the attributes of the building. So the material the building's made of and other factors like that. And if you put all that together, you end up with a map of risk. In this particular case, we've expressed it in terms of average annual loss. And that's partly because in UNHARMED, we look at multiple hazards, not just bushfire. And so average annual loss is a good way of being able to compare, I guess, the impact of different hazards. But, I talked about at the beginning, in the quote, talking about trajectories and pathways. And so really, we're not just looking at these maps as maps at one point in time or at the present. Each of these layers are models. And so we can change each of these factors. So we can change both the drivers of risk, so things like climate change or population growth or socioeconomic development, building code changes. And they can be, so these drivers of risk can be overlaid with mitigation strategies such as land use planning and building code changes and planned burning. So that's really the idea, to help you, not to predict the future, but to explore different plausible futures as a combination of drivers of risk that we can't control and mitigation strategies that we can control. And just looking, for example, at the changes over time, if the land use map in 2016 looked like this, and the building stock looked like that, but then that is changing over time. So for example, due to socioeconomic development, there'll be changes in land use. There might be demand for residential housing, and that will change the land use. And similarly, the building stock will change because of urban renewal and expansion. In terms of the fire, obviously you've got the fire intensity map in 2016, but that will be different in 2050 because of the climate change impacts, for example. Similarly, and that was mentioned in the previous talk as well, there is this dynamic linkage between changes in land use and changes in hazard, particularly due to ignition potential. And then finally, when you put all that together, you end up with a average annual loss map in 2016 that will look different in 2050 because you've got changes in both the hazard and the exposure and potentially also in the vulnerability. And then the other thing you can do, as I mentioned, is you explore the effectiveness of different mitigation strategies or long-term risk reduction strategies over these time periods, and both spatially and temporally. So for example, you could change spatial planning. So in the land use model, that's driven by a number of factors, one of which is spatial planning or zoning. So you can try that and see what happens, what impact that has on the actual losses. Similarly, you can change the building codes, and you can do that over time, obviously, as part of the renewal of the buildings over time. And you can see what the impact that might have, different ways of changing the materials you use for buildings, for example. Similarly, you can then look at different land management or fuel reduction strategies, such as planned burning or mechanical fuel load reduction, and you can see what the effectiveness of that is relative to the effectiveness of the other strategies. And similarly, you can look at education and awareness, both reducing ignition potential and also the vulnerability. And so then essentially what you end up with is these trajectories. And so that's really what in the initial quote talked about building a resilient future. So you can look at different scenarios that represent these combined effects of climate change, population growth, socioeconomic development, coupled with different risk reduction strategies such as zoning and building code changes and planned burning. And you can see the relative effectiveness of these different combined scenarios over time in terms of the risk metric, in this case, average annual loss. So we think of it as a policy wind tunnel. When before you build a car or mass produce a plane, you basically expose it to different, I guess, plausible conditions that might be exposed to during its lifetime in a physical wind tunnel. And so I guess in our case, what we're saying is before you come up with different mitigation strategies, it's a way of actually testing the effectiveness of those strategies under a range of different plausible futures to come up with the one that seems to be, I guess, result in that more resilient future. So my take-home messages, therefore, are, I think we need to think about more than fire when managing bushfire risk. Now, fire is the hazard component of the risk triangle, but when you think about losses and damage, you also need to think about exposure and vulnerability and look at that holistically, both in terms of how risk evolves and also the mitigation strategies you can employ. We also need to take a long-term view on risk reduction with a greater focus on mitigation, as John mentioned in his introduction. As I said, the future risk is a function of decisions made today, and so we need to really think about that. We also need to be more strategic and less reactive, and that's, I guess, related because generally we tend to, fire happens, there's a lot of emotion, people respond to that and think, what can we do? And people throw out lots of different options. And some of them might be the best, some might not be, whether it's cultural burns, whether it's, all sorts of different things. They all have a place. They're all important things to consider, but we need to consider all options in a rational, integrated fashion and make evidence-based decisions on all of these trade-offs rather than just being reactive and putting forward a particular solution because it sounds good. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Holger. We'll move on now to our next presenter, Professor Nerilie Abram. Nerilie is a professor in the Research School of Earth Sciences at the Australian National University, and her research focuses on how the Earth's climate has behaved over the last millennium and what that tells us about the climate changes we are seeing now. The past climate records that she develops come from corals, caves and ice cores, and she combines those with climate model data to study climate changes. And most recently, Nerilie did some work looking at the impact of climate change on the fires in Australia over the last summer. So Nerilie, welcome, and I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to talk today. I will just start by saying, yes, I come to this from a climate science perspective. So I don't have the same deep expertise as many of the panel members in fire, but I hope that I can bring a useful perspective from what we know about how we expect climate to change in the future in Southeast Australia. So the way I'm going to approach the talk today is to look at future climate and specifically focusing on Southeast Australia, and to look at what changes we anticipate in the future and the processes that link those to changes in the forest fire switches, so the fuel load, fuel dryness, fire weather, and ignition. So you'll see that the changes, as I go through, the climate changes are color-coded based on how confident we are in those changes in the future. So a red color indicates a change that we anticipate is virtually certain to happen in the future. Medium confidence in orange is given where there are multiple lines of evidence that indicate that change. And low confidence in grey is given where models either don't agree on the change or where models aren't yet able to capture the climate processes that are important for that aspect of climate change and how it influences fire risk. To start with, it's virtually certain that atmospheric carbon dioxide will continue to rise in the future. So on the surface, that might be expected to fertilise plant growth, leading to increases in fuel load. But there have been carbon dioxide enrichment experiments that have been done at the University of Western Sydney on mature eucalypt forests, which don't appear to see an increase in the biomass production of these forests in response to carbon dioxide. There's also evidence that vegetation can change its water use efficiency in response to rising atmospheric carbon dioxide rather than increasing its growth. So while we are sure that atmospheric carbon dioxide will continue to increase, there isn't clear evidence yet as to whether this will change the fuel load in eucalypt forests in Southeast Australia. Another future change that is virtually certain is that temperature will continue to rise. So rising temperature is expected to increase the vapor pressure deficit in the atmosphere, and that's an important process in drying out fuels. In the Western United States, the temperature-driven increase in vapor pressure deficit has been described as the clearest link between climate change and increasing wildfires. And rising temperatures are also expected to continue to dry the lower troposphere. And this vertical change in the atmosphere makes it easier for fires to develop into extreme pyroconvective events. And finally, as temperatures continue to rise, we'll also see heat waves becoming more common, lasting longer, and becoming more intense. So what that means is that this virtually certain increase in rising temperatures we expect will cause the fuel in our forests to become drier and for the fire weather to become more dangerous. If we move on to rainfall, we have moderate confidence that in Southeast Australia, rainfall in the cool season will continue to decline. That's an ongoing change that's related to a positive trend in the southern annular mode. So in the latest generation of climate models, the agreement on these cool season rainfall changes has increased. So this is a change that we are reasonably confident about, that the models give us a consistent answer and we understand the underlying process as to why we expect cool season rainfall to continue to decline. So what that means is that we would expect the landscape to become drier in the future. Not necessarily in the fire season, but in the time leading up to our fire seasons. The drier landscape also interacts with the atmosphere and that exacerbates temperature rise and causes the temperature rise to be even worse. And when we combine a dry landscape with heat waves, we then end up with stress on vegetation. We have vegetation shedding leaves, and if that stress is severe enough, we can see tree mortality. So that decline in cool season rainfall, we would expect to have the potential to increase the fuel load in our forests and to increase the dryness of that fuel. If we then look at the rainfall in the warm season, we have low confidence in what's going to happen in Southeast Australia. And that's because models currently produce a range of possibilities. So some models suggest that this area will become wetter in the warm season, and others suggest that the climate will become drier. The central estimate is for little change in the warm season rainfall in Southeast Australia in the future. In terms of climate variability, this is the year-to-year variations in our weather and our climate that can intensify climate extremes. So in the warm season, if we look into the future, we expect that the positive trend in the southern annular mode will pause over the coming decades. And that's due to recovery of the ozone hole because of the success of the Montreal Protocol. So we don't really expect that the southern annular mode in the warm season, in the fire season, will change our fire risk terribly much in the coming decades. But if we move to the tropical oceans, there we do see that climate is changing the way that the variability, climate change is changing the way that the variability in the tropical oceans operates. So in the tropical Pacific, we expect an increase in extreme El Nino and La Nina events. And in the tropical Indian Ocean, we expect that the positive Indian Ocean dipole events will occur more often and they'll become stronger. So both of those changes in the tropical oceans to the north of Australia, in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, would be expected to lead to more frequent hot and dry years over Southeast Australia, promoting drier fuels and dangerous fire weather. And then finally, we know that cold fronts passing over Southeast Australia are very important for our fire risk. They cause atmospheric instability that allows extreme fires to develop. They're often associated with strong winds that help to dry fuels and make the fire weather, the weather more dangerous for fires. And these fronts can also generate lightning strikes that ignite new fires. And there is some evidence that frontal activity will increase in Southeast Australia in the future, but there's also a really large range of variability of fronts in models, and global scale climate models don't have the resolution to capture the important details of these fronts and how they interact with the landscape. And so because of that, the effect of increasing frontal activity in the future is described in this assessment as having low confidence at the moment, but it is an active area of research within the Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes. So to summarise, all in all, what the assessment shows is that there are multiple ways in which future climate changes will alter the fire risk in Southeast Australia. Importantly, all of the changes that we see, and we have moderate to high confidence over, work together to increase fire risk. We don't see any clear evidence for future climate changes that would act to reduce fire risk. So we have these multiple compounding influences of climate change on fire risk, and those compounding influences mean that we also shouldn't necessarily expect that the increase in fire risk will happen gradually or linearly as our climate warms. But the take-home message that I really want to get across as well is that while we have all of this evidence that points towards climate change continuing to make fires worse, the future isn't fully set yet. So we're currently living in a world that's warmed by about 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. But the choices that we make as to how quickly we address the underlying problem of climate change will be really important in determining how quickly and how much the risk of fires increases in the future. So because of this, it's critically important in my mind that when we discuss the ways that we can better adapt and respond to fires, we also discuss this alongside the need to mitigate climate change so that we give those adaptation strategies the best chance of being successful. Thanks.
Thank you, Nerilie. And I think that is your parting words were a good reminder that we often have conversations that look at reducing bushfire risk and climate and how we can minimise the impact of climate change, and they do end up being in two separate pieces, which is not particularly helpful. Just before we move on to our last speaker, I'm surprised we don't have more questions coming through because there are, I would have thought, many questions around climate change and values at risk and future risk. So I'd encourage anyone that does have a question, they're thinking about it, to go into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And whilst you're doing that, our final speaker is David Salas Mélia. He's a researcher at Meteo France's Centre National de Recherche Météorologique in Toulouse. He's the head of the large-scale meteorology and climate group there. And the main missions of the group are to better understand the mechanisms and impacts of climate change, to study the chemical composition of the atmosphere, to assess seasonal climate predictability, and to produce estimates of future climate change in support of IPCC reports. David's research focuses on the role of ice in the climate system. To this end, he created and developed the gelato sea ice model, and he's also studying how climate change is affecting the Greenland ice sheet and how it is contributing to sea level rise. Welcome, David, and I'll pass over to you.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, John, for this very nice introduction. So I will be very short since it wasn't planned right from the beginning that I should give a talk. So John has already talked about our activities, our main activities at CNRM GMGEC, the Climate and Air Composition Unit. So one thing I would like to mention is that we have a complete chain of climate modeling, I would say, from carbon emissions and also aerosol and chemical precursors of aerosols to relatively small-scale climate from a global scale to 2.5 kilometers. So very high resolution models, which allow us to resolve some small-scale phenomena. Also, we have a climate predictability activity. So we developed the French seasonal and sub-seasonal climate forecast model, and we run it. And also at Meteo France, we developed different products from these climate predictions, and this is all integrated in the Copernicus European system. And also we have an air quality, more globally, an atmospheric composition activity. We have an activity focused on biomass burning and the transport of particles coming from biomass burning, long distance transport in particular. And so these are our main topics. So next slide, please. Thank you. So I won't show results here because I think we're also here to try and know each other and perhaps see where we can collaborate. But this is just to present our global climate system. So our tools are these ones. First, a model which is used within CMIP6, an atmosphere ocean general circulation model, which is named CNRM CM6, which consists of ARPEG, the climate version of the French numerical weather prediction model, ARPEG, so coupled with the ocean model NEMO and the land surface model, a platform which is represented to the left. Top left, we have what I could call the physical system. You can see that this system includes a representation of groundwater. We have that in our system. And there are a few models from including that. We also have floodplains. That's the kind of risk that we can assess also for in terms of changes for the future. We have a representation of different surfaces, of course, snow and deserts and also vegetation. And even when we use that platform, that surface platform at high resolution, we have a representation of cities when we use that at a resolution of 1 kilometer or less. And that in our global climate system, we have interactive aerosols, especially we take into account black carbon emissions due to wildfires, and this is interactive in the system. We also have a 3-dimensional stratospheric chemistry, And actually, when there are very, very big fires, there can be interactions with, especially in the high troposphere, low stratosphere, there are interactions between CO and ozone, and this is all interactive in our climate system. I already mentioned that we also have an air quality activity with a model which can be global at 1 kilometer resolution, and which is we also have a nested version of Mocage in that global system that runs at a resolution of about 10 kilometers horizontally. In terms of climate risks, because that's the topic of that session, well, I have to say that for the time being, our risk studies are mainly focused on mainland France and overseas, but of course we can share expertise, and we're fully open to collaboration, and this is not only exclusive, we also study risks, some risks globally. The kind of risks we study are high precipitation events, like those which happen nearly every year along the French Mediterranean. High precipitation events can cause daily precipitations up to 500 millimeters of rain in just 24 hours, and with, of course, lots of sometimes casualties due to that, and destructions. We now also have the possibility to track big convective cells, because some of these are resolved explicitly when we run our atmospheric model Abram at a resolution of 2.5 kilometers. So we use artificial intelligence to do that, to track the cells within our model. We also have a tropical cyclone activity because we study climate risks in the French overseas as well. So we do that in all the basins, all the oceans basins, because we Guadeloupe and Martinique are in the French West Indies. Well, we study tropical cyclones in the North Atlantic basin due to that, tropical. In the Indian Ocean, also near La Réunion Island, near Madagascar, and also the influence of tropical cyclones in Polynesia. We are also very much focused on the water resources and their changes in the future, heat waves, droughts, and many impacts that we can address with our models at Meteo. So to conclude, I would say that several topics that we address at CNRM have connections with wildfires. Well, for example, we're starting to investigate the added value of running our seasonal production system with an Earth system model, which resolves especially the wildfires. Well, at least there is a probability, a likelihood of wildfires depending on the weather conditions, and so there is a description of the possible occurrence of wildfires in the system. Our ESM transports the particles produced by biomass burning, and so we're just starting that activity within a European project. And of course, there are connections with atmospheric composition activities, and also with carbon fluxes in our Earth system model. So, well, I have presented a range of tools, and perhaps that can help us to think about possible collaborations for future activities. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And we'll move over to questions with our panel at the moment. And just to start, a question that's come through from Lucinda Nerilie is, how much do paleoclimate studies contribute to our understanding of the impact of climate on fires Are there any geological time periods that are particularly analogous for the kind of fire behaviour we are seeing in Australia today?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Lucinda. So in terms of the study that I was talking from in the presentation today, we used the paleoclimate context in that study to better understand how climate variability is changing. And so that was at least using the last 1,000 years to put into context how variability of the Southern Annular Mode, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and the Indian Ocean Dipole are changing, and then to look at sort of the context for that when you look into climate models moving forward in time. And so that paleoclimate context there shows us that we are moving climate variability outside of its normal range of variability. So we can see that we're doing something quite unusual to the climate in terms of how it's operated in the past. There are other studies that have used paleoclimate in terms of looking at charcoal studies and then relating that to climate processes. And so over the very long term, we can see that it appears that the dominant factor in terms of natural changes in fire behavior in the past have been temperature, at least over the glacial interglacial type timescales, and probably in that regard in terms of how that changed vegetation types. There are other times where we can see rainfall effects as well. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but there's a number of ways that we can get interesting perspectives from paleoclimate data, but I wouldn't say that there is anything in the paleoclimate record that I would say is analogous to where we're going.
Thanks, Nerilie. And I've got a question for Adrien and Fabien in New Caledonia. A quick look at what the information that you provided us, and a quick look through Google on the internet, tells me that there are a lot of species that are at high risk in New Caledonia for becoming extinct and being lost from the environment. How well does the community in New Caledonia understand that, and do they care?
This is quite a complicated subject in New Caledonia. I mean, fire is really a tool that people use, especially on customary lands. We've shown that a huge part of bushfires are triggered on customary lands here in New Caledonia. So overall, I mean, people are aware of the richness of our biodiversity and also of its vulnerability. Sorry, but it's quite complicated because really fire is an ancestral tool that they've been using to clean up their field, to plant their crop, and lots of people think that they control it, but accidents always happen every year, and it's not exclusively people on customary lands. You also sometimes have accidents about people lighting up a barbecue close to a forest, and he lights up the whole forest. So globally, I think people are aware of the vulnerability of our nature, but the complicated thing is it's into their habits. Really, the use of fire is into people's habits here.
Thank you. And Holger, a question for you. The modelling that you use, looking at annual average losses, do you get a sense, because many of the changes that come around, also the improvements you can make, it take a long time to come. When you run the models, what is the minimum time before you start to see a benefit from the mitigation things that you put in place to try and prevent bushfire or other natural hazard impacts?
Thanks, John. That's a really interesting question, because there are different strategies work at different timescales, and also the who bears the cost varies as well. So, for example, if you think about plant burning, that the impact obviously can be felt in the next bushfire season. Excuse me, but if you change building codes, you're not going to, unless it's a new development, you're not going to raise every house and rebuild it. So obviously that comes down to the natural renewal rate of when people are building. And similarly, if you change building codes, it takes a long time, but the costs are borne by individual house owners. Whereas, if you think about planned burns, it's borne by the public or government. And so really it comes down to those different effects. And similarly with land use planning, obviously, if you stop people from going somewhere, the impact is immediate. But obviously if people are living in a particular place, then it takes time. So I think that's a really interesting discussion around, you know, who's responsible, who pays, over what timeframes are we looking at.
Yeah, thank you. And David, a question for you. Do you model the vegetation underneath the climate model? And is it an interactive vegetation model if you use it, or is it a static model? And do you project that model into the future with the possibility of what climate change will do to the vegetation?
In our Earth system model, we have an interactive vegetation model that we are trying to improve, but there is a vegetation model. And the mortality of vegetation is taken into account as if there is not enough water to feed the vegetation, so the vegetation dies. And this has an impact. We could check that on carbon fluxes and water fluxes, and even on region climate in some areas. Because, so we have our Earth system model, and we also have the underlying physical climate model, and these are really seamless. We just tune the physical core, and actually our Earth system model is just about activating the interactive vegetation and many other components. So we can assess very cleanly, I would say, the impact of activating some components on it.
Thank you. So I have one last question that's come in from an anonymous attendee. The question is, if you had one place to start to reduce the risk of climate change and its effects on bushfires, what would it be? And I'm going to pick a climate scientist, Nerilie, and an engineer, Holger. So Nerilie, just quickly, what would your answer be to that?
Absolutely, to get on top of the climate change problem, because that's the underlying cause of why we're seeing at least the hazard side of bushfires increase. So it's one of the underlying causes, and by getting on top of that problem and addressing climate change, we also fix a whole lot of other problems that are coming our way as well.
Thank you. And Holger?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, you know, if you stop things from happening in the first place, then that's the best way to go. And I guess from a holistic risk perspective, then if you stop people from building in bushfire prone areas, that's another one of those where you don't have a problem if if things you value aren't there. But generally the answer is it depends. You know, I think people like to look for silver bullets and magic fixes. I think it really depends on circumstances, you know, particular locations, that there's lots of factors. I think we need to look at that holistically on a case-by-case basis, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. And I suspect now the reality is we need a parallel track, that we really do need to try and minimise what climate change is, but we need to deal with what we're facing right now because it's here and we're living through it. Look, I would like to thank our panellists for this afternoon. We've got Adrien, Fabien, Holger, Nerilie, David. Thank you for being part of the panel today. Hopefully we've raised some questions for the audience and given them some answers. I have noticed in some of the questions there are some links that we might put some people together who have suggested they might like to work together. So thank you for those people that have made those suggestions. And now I'd like to pass over to the CEO of the Bushfire Natural Hazards Sea, Dr. Richard Thornton, to take up the next panel session. Thank you, Richard.
Hi, good evening and good morning. Welcome to the final session, which is far more a focus on the how around collaboration than the what. This is a session that's aiming to try and give some information about how we might connect, what are the sort of mechanisms that exist throughout both France, Europe and within Australia to make these things happen. Our CRC has been trying to foster these sorts of collaborations for many years now. And I'm sure as we transition into the new centre that was announced back in July, we'll continue to do that as much as we can. And indeed, we're already in a couple of bids into the European Union at the moment, along with some of our colleagues from Europe. This session is fairly tight in timing. We won't be taking Q&A at the end of it, but don't stop putting in your questions because we will try and endeavour to answer them offline so that we can do that. So each presentation will present briefly on their topics as we move through. As I said, there won't be any Q&A directly after this. So our first panelist is Nishant Shandilya from Euraxess. Nishant is the regional representative of Euraxess in Australia and New Zealand. It's an initiative of the European Commission that addresses barriers to the mobility of researchers and seeks to enhance scientific collaboration between Europe and the rest of the world. Welcome, Nishant.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon to all of you here in Australia, and good morning to the colleagues joining in from Europe. As mentioned, I'm Nishant Shandilya, the regional representative for Euraxess Australia and New Zealand. Today, I'll be highlighting a potential Australia-Europe collaboration opportunity specifically based on the European Green Deal. So let's begin. The first thing that we need to understand is what is the European Green Deal. As you know, climate change and environmental degradation are an existential threat to Europe and the world. To overcome these challenges, Europe needs a new growth strategy that will transform the Union into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy where there are no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, of course. Economic growth is decoupled from resource use, and no person and no place is left behind. Having said all these, the European Green Deal is a plan to make the EU's economy sustainable. This can be done by turning climate and environmental challenges into opportunities and making the transition just and inclusive for all. So how is it possible to make EU climate neutral in 2050? Reaching this target will require actions by all sectors of the economy, including investing in environmentally friendly technologies, supporting industry to innovate, rolling out cleaner, cheaper, and healthier forms of private and public transport, decarbonizing the energy sector, ensuring buildings are more energy efficient, and working with international partners to improve global environmental standards. So, having said all this, let's move on to a particular call called European Green Deal call. The Green Deal call will mobilize research and innovation where projects expected tangible and visible results relatively quickly and show how research and innovation can provide concrete solutions for the Green Deal main priorities. It is structured, as you can see on the screen, into 11 areas. 8 thematic areas reflecting the key work streams of the European Green Deal. In each area, one or more topic addresses the challenges outlined in the respective stream. Topics target specific, high-impact technological and societal innovations that can help advance the sustainable transition relatively quickly. It also includes, as you can see in the bottom, 3 horizontal areas that cut across 8 thematic areas and offers a longer-term perspective in achieving the transformation set out in the Green Deal. With all this said, wildfire are addressed in Area 1. Topics under this area contribute several Green Deal objectives at the same time: climate mitigation by greenhouse gas emission reduction, climate adaptation, biodiversity preservation, decrease of pollution, etc. Positive impacts also include health, safety, citizen engagement, and socioeconomic resilience. Each of these topics cut across and integrate different disciplines and sectors. Now, for us, the interesting aspect is topic 1, preventing and fighting extreme wildfires with the integration and demonstration of innovative means. The Green Deal explicitly calls to reduce incidence and extent of forest fires. It also calls to boost the EU's ability to predict and manage environmental disasters as an immediate priority. But how or why is that a concern? Large-scale and more intense wildfires are becoming an increasing concern. More and more EU citizens suffer directly and indirectly from wildfires. So if you look at between 2017 and 2020, fires have killed hundreds and ravaged forests and natural sites, not only in Southern Europe, but increasingly also in Central, Eastern, and Northern Europe. In addition to this extraordinarily socioeconomic impact in terms of loss of human lives, of not only residents and first responders, health, infrastructure, and economic activity, there are wildfire events that have serious and sometimes irreversible economic and ecological impact, while considering soil and water degradation and biodiversity loss. So moreover, wildfires are among the first contributors to climate change with up to 20% of total global greenhouse gas emissions per year. In addition, also large wildfires can increase air pollution over thousands of square kilometers with a sharp increase in airborne fine particle and gaseous air pollutants. Extreme wildfire events, specifically in Southern Europe in 2017 or 18, and in California, Brazil, and Australia in 2019, are likely to become more common in Europe. So what should we do? The new context of extreme wildfire requires accelerating the shift towards a more holistic fire management approach that integrates environmental, climate, health, and safety, cultural, and socioeconomic aspects. So let's look at the general approach here. First, research, demonstration, and deployment of innovative means and methods tailored to extreme wildfire behavior, such as better techniques, models, solutions, or for the matter, capabilities for preventing, predicting, monitoring, and fighting wildfires. Second, proactive governance, large-scale and community-based risk assessments, awareness, and preparedness, where not just citizens, local communities, but forestry sector as a whole plays a central role. Third, the approach should be systemic. By that, what I mean is encompassing different climate scenarios, biogeographical, or for that matter, socioeconomic context, and means for faster and smarter management of all the phases. And last but not the least, innovative means and methods need to be developed, integrated, and demonstrated on the field, and tailored to geographic and socioeconomic scenarios with different types of fuels or landscape and biodiversity values and scale. So this specific call will speed up the adaptation process to extreme wildfires by advancing and applying research and innovative ideas, including demonstration pilot sites, while making best use of existing data, example, remote sensing, in situ or community-based data, technologies, example, big data and artificial intelligence, and services as Copernicus, and closely engaging and coordinating all concerned actors and communities for each phase. So what is expected impact? With respect to 2019, the target by 2030 in Europe are 0 fatalities from wildfires, 50% is reduction in accidental fire ignition, 55% is reduction in emissions from wildfires, also control of any extreme and potentially harmful wildfires in less than 24 hours, 50% is Natura 2000 protected areas to be fire resilient, 50% is reduction in building losses, 90% is losses from wildfire insured, and 25% is increase in surface area of prescribed fire treatments at EU level. The idea is for the most promising results to be demonstrated, to be upscaled and deployed. And the last part, the most important point for this call is that the international cooperation is encouraged, in particularly with United States, Canada, Australia, Russia, Brazil, South America, Indonesia, Japan, and South Africa. The idea is to leverage knowledge, resources, and best practices, as well as to decrease risks and increase impacts worldwide. So looking at the timeline, a stakeholder feedback survey on the call area ran from 19 May to 3 July. Almost 6,000 survey responses and 500 documents were uploaded. And this particular call area 1, received 628 responses. The final topic and the budget figures will be formally disclosed tomorrow. That is on 18th of September. And a first dedicated 40-minute info session will take place on 23rd September afternoon at the Research and Innovation Days. I provided the link to it as well. And I encourage all of you who are interested to learn more on this, just to tune into this free event. With that, I'd like to wrap up my presentation. And since all of you are on your laptop or phone, I'll just encourage you to follow Euraxess Australia and New Zealand if you want to remain updated with relevant European research-related news and events in the future. Thank you very much with that, and I'll welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Nishant. As we said, I think we'll deal with questions offline later on. I noticed there's a couple of questions coming in, which is great. Up next, we have Nathalie Simenel from the French Embassy. Nathalie works at the Embassy of France in Australia, where her role is to engage with the scientific academic communities. in order to promote structural bilateral cooperation between France and Australia at researcher, institution and government level. Please welcome Nathalie. Over to you, Nathalie.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. So yes, for France, collaboration and international collaboration is very important, and the embassy has put in place a set of programs supporting the initiation or the strengthening of research and innovation collaboration between France and Australia. So these programs are seed funding, but they address the specific needs for students, researcher or multi-actor collaborations. And if these, if the first development of these collaborations are successful, then they can develop into more ambitious or more structured forms of collaborations, such as, for example, the CNRS or INSERM joint laboratories, or also they can ask for French or Australian or European funding, such as we had an example with Nishant. So for the students, we have tools for student mobility. The Nicolas Baudin program is dedicated to bachelor, master or PhD students. It has 3 streams. So here, the first stream is the general stream, which supports the mobility of students from Australia to France, either in the framework of student exchange or when the student is enrolled in an entire degree in a French university. It takes the form of a travel grant to cover the international travel expenses. Then we have the Internship in France initiative. This one proposes research internships in France for Australian students with an industry partner. The objective is to create pipelines linking academia and industry. So these internships are co-funded by the French Embassy, the French host institution, and the Australian Home Institution, as well as the industry partner. And many organizations have supported this initiative, for example, Naval Group, Thales, Total, or Airbus. But of course, any organization in the field of bushfire and natural hazard management is welcome to participate. And then the most recent initiative is the Internship in Australia initiative, which have been created with the South Australia government support. It offers similar opportunity but this time for French students to do an internship in Australia within a university of the Group of 8 or the Flinders University or the UniSA. And for this initiative, the industry partner is Naval Group or Thales. So these are our first stream of program for student mobility, but we also have another who is called Choose France Short Programs. So this program supports small events such as summer school programs or workshops, which are jointly set up by French and Australian research and education organizations. This initiative will grant up to 4,000 euros for a project, which is around 6,500 Australian dollars. And its objective is to encourage mobility and collaborations. Then for PhD students and researcher mobility, we have the FASIC program. So FASIC is a PhD, which means Programme Uber-Curien. So this program has been set in place by France with many other countries, around 40 countries, and it's to foster international research collaboration. The FASIC is the Programme Uber-Curien specific to Australia. It means French-Australia Science and Innovation Collaboration. And it will support excellent joint bilateral scientific projects co-designed by the French and Australian teams and co-funded by, on the French side, the FASIC program, and on the Australian side, the Australian Institution or Research Laboratory. FASIC has 3 streams, as you can see. So the PhD program to support the mobility of PhD students. It can be from France to Australia or from Australia to France. There's the FASIC researcher program, which supports the mobility of postdoc or a researcher only from France to Australia. And then the FASIC workshop program, which supports the organization of jointly designed workshops in France or in Australia. And this program aims at promoting future bilateral research networks, but also at initiating the development of international joint structures, and when it's relevant, at creating industry engagement with the academia network. So on this picture here, you can see a successful FASIC research laureate who had a very successful collaboration, which is now becoming an international research project. So it gets the support of the CNRS. So these are all the embassy programs to foster scientific mobility. But now I will introduce you to the unavoidable platform for French-Australian collaboration in research and innovation, which is the AFRAN Association. So AFRAN stands for Australian French Association for Research and Innovation. It is an incorporated association that aims to actively promote the development of cooperation between France and Australia in the areas of research and innovation. So it has, it provides an online networking and collaboration platform, and I invite you to visit the website, the LinkedIn and Twitter of AFRAN. It will also organize a series of networking events and fora, and you can see here one of the many examples. AFRAN has an annual call for projects to support this kind of events. And the association is structured into local hubs and thematic hubs. So for example, in this last photo, you can see the AFRAN Energy Hub, which has been created in 2018 and is now becoming, is now getting support from the CNRS and other partners to become an international research network. So maybe the bushfire science could create an AFRAN community on bushfire. And I will conclude by saying that there are many opportunities to create links between France and Australia in the field of bushfire and natural hazard management. It can be at the French or the European levels. You know, there are European initiatives such as the Label for European Resilient Society, which aims at producing a European tool for assessing the resilience of society to respond as closely as possible to citizen needs in the occurrence of a hazard. But there are also New Caledonian initiatives, such as we have seen in the previous panel, with the InSight project to extract and monitor burn areas to study fire regimes. And also many links could be created with projects using satellite data, such as the Copernicus Emergency Management Service, to help, for example, firefighters with data from space. So please let me know if you are interested, and I'd be happy to continue this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie. I'm sure there is plenty of interest in a number of those opportunities. Our final speaker for panel 3 is Sarah Brown. Sarah is the Chief of Staff in the Office of the Australian Chief Scientist, and importantly, she'll be the incoming counsellor in Europe for industry, science, energy and resources. So Sarah will give us an overview of some of the Australian activities. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Richard. Hello, so as Richard introduced me, I'm Sarah Brown. I'm the Chief of Staff to Australia's Chief Scientist. For those who may not be aware, Australia's Chief Scientist's role is to provide advice to the government on science and technology and to be an advocate for science in the community. And I'm going to be the incoming councillor in Europe, and I've got a background in international science relationships with France. I managed the section looking after the relationship a couple of years ago. So all very good. So, of course, we've got a really strong collaborative relationship between Australia and France. And Australia itself is a very internationally collaborative research nation. Of course, you know, France is Australia's 6th highest publication partner for the 5 years 2015 to 2019, with over 3,500 co-publications annually. So that just shows the kind of level of relationship we have. I thought I'd start with talking about some of the work the Office of the Chief Scientist has done in the bushfire space. So earlier this year, of course, with the Black Summer of Fires, there was a lot of activities that started, and Minister Andrews, our Minister, convened a number of bushfire science roundtables. And out of those roundtables, she requested the Office of the Chief Scientist to do a mapping of the research and technology capability in Australia around bushfire science. And so we did that mapping work, and that's available on the Office of the Chief Scientist website if you would like to see it. But what it kind of showed is that the huge amount of capability in Australia's system, and that, you know, we're second in the world for bushfire related research output behind the US. We've got really good collaboration with France, though of course not at the volume we'd like, and I think, you know, workshops like this are great in terms of building the relationship between Australia and France in this important area. In terms of the research strengths, I'm sure it's all areas you've had presentations about during these 3 days: fire ecology, modelling and predicting fire behaviour, community engagement, health impacts of smokes and bushfires. And of course, one of the other things the mapping report found is that knowledge brokers are really key. Knowledge brokers like the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, for their role in terms of bringing together the needs of the operational agencies and the capabilities of the research sector to ensure that we really get the change that we require in the way we manage these issues. Another really important piece of work that was conducted this year that the Office of the Chief Scientist has been involved in was the CSIRO report on climate and disaster resilience. Dr. Finkel chaired the expert advisory panel for that report, and it provides a really good indication of the kind of priority areas Australia's identified to build resilience. The focus of the report was on the science and technology needs or things we could do to improve capability in Australia. And so that report is a really good pointer in terms of what the big priorities are. And I think that collaboration with France on these areas would be of benefit. You know, the priorities included things like scenario planning, modelling, warning systems, air quality measurement and prediction, including smoke and plume forecasting, and adoption and integration of Earth observation technologies. And I note all the comments about Copernicus in the previous presentation, very important part of that. And then, of course, as Richard's talked about, there's the new centre, the announcement in July of the $88 million in funding over the next 10 years from the Australian government for this new National Research Centre into Natural Hazard Resilience and Disaster Risk Reduction. And it includes that extra $2 million for the current CRC to continue their important work following the Black Summer bushfires. And it's all about delivering that multidisciplinary evidence-based research to support the needs of emergency services agencies and communities in Australia. And it will be highly domestically collaborative, and as Richard said, I really would expect it to be highly internationally collaborative. So as that centre takes shape, I think that's a really important vehicle for thinking about the partnerships and what are needed internationally. So to kind of move away from that stuff to talk more about the generic things around supporting collaboration between Australia and France. The Australian government, the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources has developed this resource, partnering with Australia on innovation, science and research. You can see a picture there. I've got a hard copy here to show off, and that's available on the department's website. And the good thing about that document is it's a one-stop shop for listings of partners, funding vehicles, things like mobility programs that are available in Australia, because there is such a diverse range of programs in Australia that can support international collaboration. It's one of the kind of tenets of the way the government supports international collaboration, that it makes the majority of its programs open to international partnerships. And so that, of course, means that if you want to navigate it, there's a lot of different programs to get across. And so this document's a really good source of information for all of those things. But I'll provide some kind of highlights through this presentation. Now, of course, the partnering doc is a companion piece to the policy document for the Australian government on international science and innovation collaboration, the Global Innovation Strategy. The strategy provides a whole of government framework that encourages Australian researchers and businesses to collaborate with international partners. And it's got a really strong connection on, a strong focus on connecting businesses and researchers. And of course, I always view businesses, kind of code for end users. And so, we're talking about operational agencies and all of that as well. It's about wanting to focus on that delivery of real world impacts and bringing those collaborations together. So under the Global Innovation Strategy, there's a couple of dedicated initiatives. Now, some of these might not be as relevant to bushfire science and disaster resilience, but I think it was good to give you kind of an overview of the 4 programs underneath this strategy. So you've got the Global Innovation Linkages Program. It's the one with the largest funding amount, up to $1 million over a maximum of 4 years. And then you've got the Global Connections Fund, which is more about that small money to kind of do that initial connection. So you've got 7,000 for the priming grants, and I think it's 50,000 for the bridging grants. Now, from what you're talking in terms of New Caledonia and some of those issues with the Asia Pacific region, I think the Regional Collaborations Program's are really relevant there. While it's got that focus on the Asia Pacific, other countries can partner into these larger scale collaborations to solve regional challenges. And then of course you've got the landing pads, which is for startups, bit less relevant perhaps, but who knows? And of course Australia has one of these in Berlin. Now, as I was saying, the majority of the funding programs the Australian government supports are open to supporting international collaboration. So I've got kind of a snapshot of some of the most relevant sources of funding. So you've got the Australian Research Council, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and it's open to international researchers applying through an eligible Australian institution and supports fundamental research fellowships and collaboration. Of course, you've got the Cooperative Research Centres program, of which, of course, the CRC is an exemplar of a wonderful thing that's been supported out of that program. It supports industry-led, outcome-focused collaborative research, and there's 2 streams of funding under that program: the Cooperative Research Centres, which is the largest scale centres, and the Cooperative Research Centre, so the CRC projects, which are more of that kind of smaller scale, tighter time frame projects. And of course, outside of the climate and disaster resilience, more in the health space, you've got 2 main funding vehicles in the Australian system: the Medical Research Future Fund and the National Health and Medical Research Council, both of which can support international collaboration. So that's the kind of short summary. So at the back of my presentation, you've got the links to the capability map, the CSIRO report, and the partnering doc. And I hope all of that information is useful to build your collaboration and to take advantage of the conversations that have happened through this workshop.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm sure we'll make use of you when you get over to Europe as well to help bridge some of those gaps. I'd like to thank all of the presenters in this session and hand back to John. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Richard. And that concludes the panels of the 3 days of the France and Australia Bushfire Science Workshop. So thank you to everybody that's been a part of that program and for those of you that are still here. To wrap up and close the workshop, I'd like to introduce 3 speakers, one from each of the organisers for that. Firstly, can you please welcome Thierry Corrège from the French Embassy in Australia.
Thanks for this excellent meeting. I think it was an initiative originally from the French Embassy, from my predecessor, and because I just arrived as a new scientific attaché. And I think the response from Australia was excellent. And really, I'm very happy to see the result. We had a great response, and it went really far beyond our expectations, because there's been more than 200 people registered, I think, And that shows that even in these difficult times, people are keen to still communicate and try to foster collaborations. So I'm really happy with this outcome. Sorry. I want to thank quickly some people who worked in the shadow to set up this meeting. People at CRC like David Bruce or Bayas Mianeos, or at Group of 8 we have Cheryl Cutt, who did a great job too, and at the embassy Nathalie, who just talked before me, and Priscilla also, she did a great job. So this meeting was successful because of people in the shadow that we didn't see during the meeting. I think there are a lot of keywords that emerge from this workshop, and the interesting thing for me is that you can see that basically we have the same keywords in France and in Australia, but with different approaches. I heard some modeling, I saw some modeling work which is different in Australia and in France, and I think there's really room for collaboration in many areas. Some keywords of prevention and firefighter safety or initial conditions and so on. And there is different approaches. There are different approaches between the two countries. So I think it's a good thing that we will foster collaboration in that sense with that. And finally, I will finish with the tools. I think we've had a presentation of the different tools that are available to collaborate. I think we all know that at the moment it's kind of difficult time for everybody, and especially to develop collaboration in these COVID times. But I think we have to be inventive. And for example, what we showed you, the tools we have at the embassy, they are, we can think of new tools. And if you have suggestions, don't hesitate to contact us. We will examine your suggestions, and everything is changing, and we can develop new tools in these particular times. So I really want to thank everybody for participating, and my colleagues at the French Embassy who did a great job, and CRC and Group of 8. It's really, for me as a scientist, I was still a scientist 3 weeks ago, and I learned a lot, and I think it was a really exciting meeting, and I thank you all for that.
Thank you, Thierry, for those kind words. And I think, just to wrap up what I think I heard you saying in there too is knowledge networks are very, very important. And we have an opportunity to create some very strong networks between Australia and France. So thank you. I'd now like to pass over to Professor Kathy Belov on behalf of the Group of 8 universities.
Thank you. So yes, I'm here representing Vicky Thompson from the Group of 8. I'm Kathy Belov from the University of Sydney. So first of all, I'd like to thank all the participants and speakers. I understand we've had about 50 French researchers involved, including researchers from New Caledonia, the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC representatives. We've had about 70 plus researchers from the Group of 8 universities, and 40 plus government representatives from both federal and state governments in Australia, and many others. I'd like to also commend you all on your interest in collaborating. During these challenging times, international collaboration is so important, and those people-to-people links are so important. So I hope that you continue to grow those connections and build on the new connections that you've made. A couple of areas that jump out to me as areas for possible collaboration are around strategy, planning and policy preparation, new innovations and new technologies, working around the intangible costs of fires, and also, of course, the environmental and climate impacts of fires, and the need for better monitoring, better fire prevention, fuel reduction, and so forth. And there were many other areas touched on during the workshop. So I hope that you will continue these collaborations. It was great to have the funding presentations, to hear about where you go to get support to build on these relationships. I know there have already been requests to share contact details, and the organisers are happy to provide those contacts if you need them. And a message from the group of 8, they're really keen and ready to support you in building these collaborations, and we all look forward to seeing what fantastic collaborations emerge in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. And I think, looking at the context in Australia at the moment, it's a challenging time, both in terms of climate and some restructuring is going to come through our university system. So thank you again to the group of 8 for being part of this. I'd now like to hand back to Dr. Richard Thornton, the CEO of the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC.
Thank you, John. I'd just like to echo everything that the previous 2 speakers have said. I think it's been a great 3 days. It's always a challenge trying to get these types of events to work across time zones, so obviously different between the 2 countries. But it does show that it's possible to collaborate over these distances, given all of the other challenges that we have now. I'd also like to extend all of my thanks to the presenters who have put the effort into putting together their presentations, all of the embassy team and the team from GO8, and of course all of my team who you very rarely see because they're behind the scenes making sure that the tech works, that people know what they're doing and log in on time and all those sorts of things. So thanks to all of that, and the fact that you never see them means that they're doing a really good job. I'd also like to extend thanks to both Jean-Baptiste Philippi and Sébastien Lahaye from France, who helped to bring together the French end of this workshop series as well. I think there are many areas that are really important that we can collaborate on, and we've only touched on a selected view over the last couple of days, 3 days. There are many other areas that equally deserve to be worked on jointly. I was lucky enough to attend the OECD meeting looking at the impact of wildfires across the world earlier in the year. And it's clear that the challenges that Australia saw last year and the challenges that the US and other areas are seeing at the moment will be mirrored throughout Europe, and has been mirrored throughout Europe in the past few years. So it's really important that we do start to work together. We're happy to help wherever possible. We now have developed good relationships between ourselves, the group of 8, and the French embassy and the French researchers. So please, if you need any connections, come and talk to any of the 3 of us. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the 3 representatives of the organisations for your kind words. Look, thank you to everybody that's been part of this program for the 3 days. That we really are impressed if you've stayed on. And I've just looked at the questions and answers again, and there are people again saying, look, we'd like to collaborate. There are areas that we've got in common, and I think one of the most compelling things for me in my role at the CRC is that there is a limited amount of money to do research. And there's a lot of knowledge around the world, and the more we can share that, the more that we can work together, the easier it will be to improve public health outcomes and to reduce pain and suffering. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I do hope that we find ways to collaborate and share information. For us, the CRC website has a trove of information that can be found, and I'm sure the other organisations have that through the universities and through the French institutions as well. So please go looking for that. A reminder that the 3 nights have been recorded, so the workshops are available or will be made available on the CRC's website in coming days. Thank you all, and I wish you all a good night, a good evening, or a good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you all.